One thing that I'm very happy to see is the long rest rules. This has been another big problem with 5th edition, in that you can have you can plan a boss fight, and if you plan the boss fight and they go through the dungeon and they get just to where the final boss is, and they've had enough time pass that they're due a long rest. Most dungeons these days are written so that actually, and this is not, I don't think, intentional, but just kind of modern dungeon design, where the players could just be like, we're going to take a long rest here. And they'll take their long rest, and then your boss fight is going to be a cakewalk as a dungeon master. But the new long rest rules, which clarify some things which were implied in the 5th edition rules in 2014, but very open to interpretation, and indeed interpreted, I would say, incorrectly by sage advice columns put out by Hasbro, but there we are, is this bit here. Interrupting a long rest. A long rest is stopped by the following interruptions. Rolling initiative now interrupts a long rest. Casting a spell other than a cantrip now interrupts a long rest. Taking any damage interrupts a long rest, and an hour of walking or other physical exertion interrupts a long rest. And if you rested for at least 1 hour before the interruption, you gain the benefits of a short rest, and you can resume a long rest immediately after an interruption. And if you do, the rest requires 1 additional hour per interruption to finish. So if you roll initiative, that 8-hour long rest is going to turn into a 9-hour long rest, which means that when you are designing a dungeon, particularly one where there's going to be a boss fight, which is probably going to be most dungeons, it is now imperative, I think, that a wandering monster table be in play at all times. The frequency, however you want, I would say at least every hour, particularly in a dungeon. To be honest, in a dungeon, I'd be rolling for a random encounter every 20 minutes that they're in there. That's how frequently I would be doing it by default. Which means, on that basis, if you've got 20 minutes... So that means you've got 3 to an hour, which means that's 24 potential rolls for a random encounter during a long rest, which means that probability-wise, an encounter will take place during that long rest, which means that a long rest is going to have to take another hour, which is going to actually take that from 24 to now 27. Which means there is a 50% chance then, almost, that there will actually be 2 encounters, which then might make it 10 hours. As taking a long rest within a dungeon then becomes a very risky proposition, because you could be at the point where actually you could be having to face 3 or 4 encounters before you finish your long rest, in which case actually you might have been better off just going in for the boss fight. Or leaving the dungeon and coming back, which I think should be the intent with a dungeon, personally, though your mileage may vary. Of course, you can make that difficulty less by having it less frequently. You might do it every half an hour to do a check, in which case you're looking at 16. So there's still a small chance, or rather a large chance, that they'll face an encounter, but it's not, from a probability standpoint, guaranteed that they'll face an encounter. Or you might do it once every hour, in which case it's a less than 50% chance that they will face an encounter, but still a chance. And I think that now becomes imperative. But also, because now casting a spell other than a cantrip or taking any damage also interrupts a long rest, that does limit what people can do as part of their long rest, for example. Because you could, let's say you do the Wandering Monster table and an encounter is caused. That means there's another hour, which means there's going to be an hour. Let's say they've cast Learman's Tiny Hut here. And actually, in fairness, if they have to roll initiative, Learman's Tiny Hut's less likely to be an issue. Let's say they had rolled initiative, even though it had Learman's Tiny Hut, which is unlikely, but just bear with me here. Learman's Tiny Hut lasts for 8 hours, which means they're going to have an hour where they don't have Learman's Tiny Hut. So they might then want to cast a spell like Alarm or something to give them the opportunity to be caught out. That's going to add another hour on top of that. That's the second interruption. That's 2 hours now that the long rest has been been extended for. When they're long resting, it becomes very difficult for them to defend themselves without extending the long rest. And I think that's such an important clarification on the rules that really needed putting in place so that rest spamming isn't a thing. So I'm really glad to see that. From a Dungeon Master's perspective, that is one killer tool that we have been given as Dungeon Masters to be able to increase the difficulty of the game very simply. Because if the party are going to choose to rest in a dungeon, then that's on them in many ways, which is fair game as far as I'm concerned as a Dungeon Master.